Well, my name's Adrian Challens, and I'm standing in front of the Clare cottage. And I shall be taking you around shortly, showing you the archaeological work that's been carried out prior to the reconstruction of the cottage for educational purposes. Okay, well, Clare's cottage in the early part of the 19th century had considerably different boundaries to the boundaries which we can see at present. Now, this is in fact an old boundary of the cottage. This wall, or remains of this wall, was upstanding during the period when Clare was living here. And in fact, he does record in his notebooks about a plum tree falling down at the corner of his garden. Well, this may well be the very plum tree itself, which is actually growing against or over this rather ancient piece of walling. The Cambridge Botanical Gardens are being asked rather, to redo the cottage to the way it was in Clare's day. This means that most of the material that's in the garden at present, including perhaps buried archaeology, will undoubtedly be destroyed. So a survey was proposed to carry out archaeological investigations to detect features which may or may not belong to the Clare period or even earlier. We're at present standing in a lower part of the Clare cottage garden, which may have been an old quarry, as it's at least 1.25 metres lower than the garden nearest the cottage. This garden was investigated archaeologically on the basis of the information obtained during the geophysical survey, and the trenches, the archaeological trenches, revealed some of the features discovered to be paths. The cottage itself was divided into 5 different tenements. Each of these tenements had a share of the garden, and the paths subdivide the garden into 5 plots. Each of those plots was used for growing vegetables upon which the family had to survive. Okay, well, this is one of the garden paths of the Clare cottage, and you can see that it runs from here, where it's been excavated, through to the next trench, where it's also made up with limestone rubble and bits of brick and tile, leading directly to the door into the cottage itself. Now, this path itself is composed of limestone rubble. Within the limestone rubble, a significant amount of early 19th century pottery. And you can actually see in this tray a batch of mid-19th century pottery which was actually recovered from this upper layer within the garden. Surprisingly, in this trench, coming down to the natural limestone, came across a pit of medieval date. Now, the pit itself dates to the 13th century, contains 13th century pottery, but it was cut through a deposit containing even earlier material. And this earlier material belongs to the 11th, 12th century and was manufactured locally at a place called Stamford. As with all properties, an enormous amount of change occurred. In this case, the 1950s landowner decided that he'd like to enlarge his garden. He consequently bought the next door property and knocked it down. And these are the remains of the next door property. And we're looking here at the coal shed and the toilet. Well, the toilet door was simply torn down and thrown into the demolition rubble trench. And we can see here the hinges of the door still existing within the side of the trench. Well, in the 60s, when the property was pulled down, the previous occupants obviously didn't take everything with them. And here we have an umbrella which is still remaining within the coal shed part of the structure. All of these artefacts, finds perhaps you should call them, were actually found within this trench. In fact, here remains a pocket watch, minus its works, and bits and pieces of mid to late Victorian pottery, which fits in well with the date of the house, which would be mid-Victorian.